All right, hello everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to Wherein Fabula Fellowship tonight. We have a packed audience, standing room only. If you didn't make it, you missed out.
You're going to have to stand.
Gonna have to stand tonight. Still talking about transposition. We actually only got about 3 paragraphs in last week.
What?
Wow.
She is here.
West Coast.
You're a beast.
East
I just
Coast.
got back.
Beast.
Just got back and I'm here.
Here, let's grab
my
another
goodness.
chair.
I'm tired. I took the red eye flight back last night, so I'm not slept.
I cannot believe you're here.
We know.
I gonna miss this? Are you kidding me? We were like, I don't think Kate. I'm like, usually she tells us when she's not coming, but she seemed to be not.
I have my house shoes on, but I'm here.
I had hoped that she would be coming tonight.
Committed.
Just yeah, totally. So
And I had
our
dinner, so I got
director of
some protein
communications
bars.
just walked in the door
Yeah.
on a red-eye flight last night.
Oh, my best friend lives on the east or on the west coast.
So we have someone who takes our minutes, and that's fantastic. She's an integral part of the team.
The podcast.
You're doing great.
It's like cheers. It's cheers.
No worries, that's what I'm here for, to keep us on track. So we got a couple paragraphs in last week, and I won't say we got bogged down because I don't think it was bogged down, but we spoke a good deal about glossolalia and tongues and how that fits into his argument, how it fits into his worldview, his theological thoughts. And then when the podcast was off, we actually got really real and talked about some really cool theological and spiritual stuff. So it was pretty awesome. All right. How many have kept up with the reading? Look at that. I've seen comments from David so far and myself. That's fantastic.
Position one whole I
Sermon?
went through the whole thing.
You've already read the whole thing?
I listened to it. Is
There
it
you
like
go.
one line?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. This one thing.
Yeah, it's just one essay. It's just now the rest of you can actually listen to the whole Weight of Glory, and it's fantastic from beginning to end. It's just simply amazing. His essay on the inner ring, so good. Membership is also another fantastic one. So the whole book of Weight of Glory is really good. All right, so I know where we stopped, and we're going to start right there again. It's on the paragraph that starts, put in its most general terms. Nina?
Page 94.
Oh, I'm reading. It's good because I need to.
Yes.
So, am I reading this whole paragraph, or are you just going to stop me when I need to stop?
Go to where it says the drinking and the question mark, and we'll just pause
Okay.
there.
Put in its most general terms, our problem is that of the obvious continuity between things which are admittedly natural and things which, it is claimed, are spiritual. The reappearance in what professes to be our supernatural life of all the same old elements which make up our natural life and, it would seem, of no others. If we have really been visited by a revelation from beyond nature, is it not very strange that an apocalypse can furnish heaven with nothing more than selections from terrestrial experience, crowns, thrones, and music? That devotion can find no language but that of human lovers, and that the rite whereby Christians enact a mystical union should turn out to be only the old familiar act of eating and drinking?
What I love about Lewis is he is not afraid of a fight. He paints himself into the most drastic corners with the way he lays out arguments, and then proceeds to talk himself right out of it until at the end. You're reading this, you're going, the skeptic and the skeptics, they have a point. But by the time you get finished with the essay, you're more like, okay, I get it now, Lewis. Thank you so much. But he's masterful in the way. So why I like that is he doesn't create a straw man for the opposing view. He gives the opposing view as strong as he can. He presents their argument and then dismantles it. And I think that's fantastic. So
He confuses me a lot because I'm like, whoa, you agree with that? You know? And
Right.
then I'm like, is he really saying that? I'm like, well, he makes a good point. And then I get to the end, I'm like, wow, he just completely messed me up. Completely. It's good.
And that's someone who has mastered the art of thinking, reasoning, and prioritizing information. Now that'll get into some stuff we'll probably get into a little bit of that, but in the essay that I'm writing, it's very important that we prioritize information. you can't do correct sums if you don't prioritize information, right? We used to call it the FOIL method, but I don't know what they call it now. You do the things parentheticals first, and you do multiplication, division, then you do subtraction. If you don't do it correctly, you'll come to the wrong answer, and then you'll get somebody killed by creating something that doesn't work correctly. Yep. So prioritizing information actually is very, very important. And so, somebody give me a rhetorical summarization of what he's saying here. What's he driving at?
Essentially, that isn't it likely that everything we see here in our terrestrial experience is really informing the spiritual world we think we see, because we can't speak outside of things like crowns, authorities, principalities, all things that are derived from our experience. And instead, we're kind of imposing that upon the spiritual world rather than finding anything new in the spiritual world, because wouldn't you think there'd be something else out there for us to see rather than just what we already have seen here? So
basically, we're doing a reciprocal of Genesis, where God made man in His image. Instead, man made God in His image. Anybody else want to throw in there? So let's look at this. That devotion can find no language but that of lovers. I mean, it's such a vivid description of how we talk about devotion, abandonment, and we talk about, we read Song of Solomon with, this intimate relationship, this intimacy. We're the bride of Christ, right? And there's that union, but we can't go beyond that. I think it's interesting that and this is the whole point of this, why can't we go beyond that? Why can't we go beyond? We were listening. Do you guys like the Greatest Showman soundtrack? You guys like that?
No doubt.
This is the greatest show. Screams it.
We all love it.
I need to go listen to it.
At Oxford, I listened to it on my way to Come Alive. Was like my jam on the way into class. Sometimes I would be like dancing and just praying like through university parks, going to class. It was just, I was on such a high. And one of the songs that I loved, but I always felt missed the magical part of that, was Never Enough. Until a couple of days ago when I listened to it, reading Transposition and The Great Divorce and all these books that have shaded my thinking now. And when she says, the towers of gold are still too little, for me to hold this. And I go, oh, given our inheritance, the world is too small. Mm-hmm. The world's not enough. If you remember The Great Divorce, I think the lady's name was Sarah. It was like McDonald said, Sarah cannot go back into hell. She wouldn't be able to fit because she's full now. Mm-hmm. And so when you become fully actualized into who you're supposed to become, the world's not enough. And so maybe the song is not a negative, but actually it's a positive drawing on something deeper that's calling us. But the only way for her to express it was to say this, take all the spotlights and 1,000 stars. It's not enough. Maybe it's not selfishness. Maybe it's that deep calling to deep. She's like, I'm meant for more. I know I'm meant for more. It's a yearning. This is the echo. She's hearing that. It's like, this is not enough. I'm meant for more. And it's not a selfish human thing, but it's actually a God call and tug in her heart.
And if we take that a little further if we kind of foreshadow a little bit, the language, that language is not enough to describe our inheritance, as you're saying. How can you say anything more than towers of gold? What is it? Mm-hmm. What's more impressive than that in terms of this towering wealth? You can't come close to anything higher than that. Really, it's just you're spitting in the wind and hoping you'll get there, and you're never going to. That was like, for me, that's kind of like the starting place, is to wait. This doesn't quite line up. This doesn't quite make sense without another world. If I'm looking at it, from a logical standpoint.
It's Lewis's argument, isn't it? If there's a desire that I have on this earth that cannot be satisfied, it must be that I was meant for another world. You have hunger, you have sleep and thirst and sex and all these things, and all these things can be satisfied at some level. But there's that yearning inside, like the song says, that's never enough. It can never be filled. And if it can never be filled on this earth, it must be that we were created for more. And so, that's the other thing, and I keep coming back to this. Lewis's theology is tight. No matter what he's writing, his theology and his reasoning is tight. And so when you have a sound foundation of reasoning, this should be the outcome. This should be the predicted outcome. If you are writing from a logical, sound reasoning, then no matter what you write, you should be able to pull a thread in Narnia, and it should be able to pucker in transposition. You should be able to have that tightness inside of your reasoning. I love it how he takes the Eucharist and says the mystical union of the Eucharist. Turns out it's just eating and drinking, unless there's more, right? Mm-hmm. That's just he gives the skeptic's position very well here, the cynic as he calls it. All right, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
My love.
Yes. Let's see here.
And you may add.
Eating and drinking. Okay. And you may add that the very same problem also breaks out on a lower level, not only between spiritual and natural, but also between higher and lower levels of the natural life. Hence, cynics very plausibly challenge our civilized conception of the difference between love and lust by pointing out that when all is said and done, they usually end in what is physically the same act. They similarly challenge the difference between justice and revenge on the ground that what finally happens to the criminal may be the same. And in all these cases, let us admit that the cynics and skeptics have a good prima facie case. The same acts do reappear in justice as well as in revenge. The consummation of humanized and conjugal love is physiologically the same as that of the merely biological lust. Religious language and imagery, and probably religious emotion too, contains nothing that has not been borrowed from nature.
I mean, you start to get a little worried there. I mean, he's laying out a fantastic argument that there is nothing more. And
it helps too. Like, he came through so many different philosophical worldviews himself that he's able to build and develop these arguments in such a way that he properly presents the opposing cases.
Absolutely. So, what do you guys think about that? The difference between love and lust ends in the same act.
I understand what he's saying. I had a thought. I guess it's connected to this today. Have you seen all these ads that say be kind, and for some reason those bother me, and I couldn't put my finger on why they bother me, but it's a general. It goes along with this, where there's an idea that you can remove something from its context and it remains vital as it is. So you can remove love from its context, and the acts are the same. You can act kind from its context. From the context of that word kindness, what people are is the fruit of being in relationship with the Holy Spirit. Love, joy, peace, tenderness, kindness. All those different kind of things that are in there. And it's a bit on my mind. And today I was just thinking, I was the problem when you push something, when you remove it from the relational bounds that moorings that hold it, is that it's no longer a fruit. If it's a fruit of the Spirit, it's an overflow of the Spirit. And you remove that. This is just my thought pattern.
Yeah.
And if you remove it from it, it's no longer. If that is the fruit of the Spirit, it's no longer that anymore. And I thought about this. I was walking today. I was thinking, well, can people pursue good things aside from God? Can they actually get good outcomes? And I was just thinking, okay, I know there's people who do things, but does it end up good? Whatever that may be. For instance, because we were talking about revival today in chapels, that usually when a revival comes, certain things follow. Number one, you have salvation, but inevitably social justice things come out of a revival in the after period, in the years following. It involves a total transformation of heart, soul, community. What happens, like, and this is another thing, what happens if you take the social justice outside of the benefits of the conjugation with the Lord, and you just take it by itself outside of that loving context and just take it for what it is? It's almost like sex without covenantal relationship. I don't know. I don't have like an answer, but it's been something that's been in my mind today because I just think it's like being kind for kind's sake. This is what I thought. If it's not in the context of a fruit or an overflow of the Holy Spirit, is it really even kindness? Because truth, you can't actually be truly kind. Only the Lord is truly kind with completely pure motives. So it can only be kind from that overflow. So if it doesn't have the right heart motives, like initial starting catalyst, it's just thoughts. Can it actually still, truly, when you look in the heart of man, actually be kind?
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
adherence
more.
to a law rather than adherence to anything deeper. And if you're just following a rule book, then your heart is completely out of it.
Yeah.
Can you be kind, yet be unaware that the kindness is overflowing from the Holy Spirit?
Probably.
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, my point about this, I don't know. I mean, I think there's like, this is another thing I've been considering. I was talking to folks about this. I'm thinking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in the garden. And just probably in the context of transposition. I've come to the conclusion that every single thing is a choice between those two trees in our life. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the choice to make our own way and to do what we think is right. And to make a world the way that we think is right. Which is like pulling up love, sex, taking out the context of actually a covenantal relationship. This is what I think. And it's always a choice between, I don't know, these things have been in my mind. It just seems like it's always we're faced with this choice.
In Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about that if you set one ethic above another and you will violate all of our ethics to make that ethic supreme, you'll become a devil and a tyrant. Mm-hmm. So if you try to promote love without justice, then love will become tyrannical. Yeah. So I see what you're saying there is if you take love out of context and you do kindness for kindness' sake, not having an intention that is deeper, then it will be shallow. And at some point you're like, no, you have to be kind. And that's the most important thing is to be kind. Then you begin to set that up, and then you will break all of the rules to make sure that kindness is the supreme thing.
You will be unkind somebody to make them
yes,
kind.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, isn't that like goes back to why I feel like me and my roommate talk about this all the time with my generation and like LGBTQ, like the whole community, and how she thinks it's really going to divide the church a lot because you go back to the whole being kind thing versus discipline, and there's different denominations that believe different things, but it's just a struggle because where do you decide when to discipline versus when to just be kind? And, like you said, doing it out of sake of kindness, but there's reasons that we have boundaries, like what we've talked about before with the whole kite analogy. There's reasons we have limitations, we have boundaries, we have rules to follow for certain things. And so it's hard whenever things get kind of murky of like, where do you have a discipline versus where do you just show kindness? Does that make sense? Sorry, sort of?
No, it makes sense.
Yeah.
This is like, this we could talk about, this in transposition, and like, I feel like it's always on my mind. This core of this subject is always on my mind, what we're talking about.
Well, this is perfect because the person outside of awareness of the Spirit in their lives, and there are some Christians who fall in this category. I'm just using the blanket. People are unaware of the Spirit. They will create mimicry. And when they do that, they're expecting the same outcome, but it doesn't always land the same because they're doing it from a position. So the cynic here is looking at religion from the ground up. Mm-hmm. Does anybody know about radiation decay theory? Have you ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. So we can see back really closely to when the Big Bang happened. We can see back to really closely. There is decaying radiation that allows us to go time back really close to when that singularity happened. But one, we can't see beyond that, and we can't see it because we're looking at it from a ground level. We're looking at it from an Adamic, epistemic perspective. We're looking at it from Adam's human perspective. We're limited in what we can see. So in that, if someone is trying to create an ethic of human kindness based on the ideas of humanism or human flourishing or some other thing like that, they're not going to hit kindness. It's going to be some, roughly here, some perversion of kindness that won't actually be kindness, because you're looking to set up something here that everybody can understand, because we're getting the same outcome. So love and lust, they're the same outcome. And so you look, if I'm kind, this happens, so therefore it's the same act. The ends justify the means. I'm getting the same thing. So if I set kindness up to be the supreme ethic, well, I'm going to have the same result as someone over here being kind. But when you look at it, you're going, no, kindness comes from a divine, and I'm learning how to be kind because I am in a relationship with the divine, and he's teaching me how to be kind. That kindness is going to be different, even though some of the acts are similar. The source of your information is transpositionally interdimensional, right? And you're getting that, and you can't fully put it into words, and it fills you with things that you can't even express yet. So what do? You write books, you create art, and you move people. If you create art simply based on your experience, it's going to be shallow. It's not going to bring life. Even though you're creating paintings, where you draw your energy from is going to be, hey, come on in. That's just my thoughts on. I think that's we can get. You can have the same acts, but where you get, oh my gosh, bring it on in.
He's gonna have to stand.
Oh yeah, standing room only.
Standing room only. Wait, what, Randy?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I think just kind of building back and going back to what you were saying, kindness, like having kindness for kindness' sake versus out of an overflow of what the Lord has given. And so you need to have that when you try and build an ethic purely on the moral, like a quote-unquote moral law of we should be kind for human flourishing. You hit that dead end, as you were mentioning, and it's a moral law apart from the flourishing found within the love of Christ is doomed ultimately to fail because it ends in selfish reasons.
Yeah. And if we take it purely on a scientific ground, nothing but pure atoms whatsoever, we take it down to its basis form. Yeah, it is gray matter and the twitchings of gray matter in a brain, and ultimately what that resolves to is absolutely meaningless nothing.
Hedonism.
And but it's not even that. It's just nothing. It's just electrons moving in a soup. And then other electrons and other soups moving together, and it's just nothingness. Because there's nothing tying it together. There's nothing that it stems from.
So the intentionality of meaning, there has to be meaning.
Yeah.
And if you have meaning, then there has to be something that transcends both you and I in a conversation, in an experience, because I'm trying to express something to you, you're trying to understand something from me, and because we're trying to talk about something that is beyond both of our conscious states in that moment, we're trying to express something that's beyond our conscious state. That's something that's transpositional, that's transcendent to us, which therefore we're saying this has meaning, I've experienced this, let me try to express it to you.
Yeah.
And because of intelligence, because of human limitations, guess what words I have? Here are the words that I have. I love bourbon. I love my wife. Those two are not synonymous. But I'm limited in my language and my ability to express those things. I have to use a word, but that word with intention and meaning changes based on the context, is what Chris is saying. The context creates the differentiation. All right.
I want to throw one last anecdote in here because this is something that's also in my mind. When I was in Israel last summer, I got to spend some time with a believer on a kibbutz. It was like one of the oldest kibbutz in Israel. They've been people there. Kibbutz is like
when the Jews folk.
Yeah, when the Jews first came over, they were actually, you've heard the Frankfurt School, they were actually communists, and they would form these, and they're still over there, these little communities that were like really heavily communist Marxist, where no one owned anything. But it went even further than that. They gave up their parents, so children were not raised by their parents. They were raised in community. and the parents lived in a different place. So a friend of mine who's this like believer, and he's a fifth generation. His parents, they came over in like the 1860s to South Galilee when the first Zionist kibbutz from Germany. And he talked about his like, when he became a believer, when he came to know Messiah, Jesus, the healing work he had to do, because when he talked about like not having parents, like being raised by a community is not the same thing, transpositionally, as having a mommy and daddy in the house. And he said it was wounding, and he had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And that's the kind of thing I'm saying, that like you can't just change people and say anybody's your parents. And that's what they did. And it actually causes bad things. It causes people without conscience. Anyways.
Awesome.
You're kind of jumping ahead, but that goes back to, he has a whole thing about this with the dog, with the pointing, like when it talks about meaning and fact, and how, whenever dogs, you point at something, they don't look where you're pointing, they look at your finger, because it's all fact and no meaning. And I think that was like the best example that I've heard of this. As soon as I saw that, I was like, he always does that. He always brings in the most perfect analogy or some kind of anecdote, like personal anecdote or something, to tie it all together. But that goes exactly with what you're saying with the difference in fact and meaning and why it's so important.
Metaphors are great if you have a good foundation and a handle on logic, and you can actually the rhetoric and metaphors and analogies are meant to make the complex simple. But if you don't understand what you're doing, rhetoric and analogy and metaphors can actually make things veiled and harder and vague, and make them actually more complex than they need to be. You can take something simple and make it complex by using rhetoric. By using the tools incorrectly, you can actually create chaos instead of order. And Lewis is so good at taking chaos and bringing it into order, and like, oh, this is great. Okay, Nina, are you still here? Mm-hmm. We got our train going. We got our coffee grinder in the background. You know this is live.
Happy stay alert. Makeup, headache, anything you've got going on. It's good for all of it.
Where should I put it? Anywhere?
If you've got a headache, wherever your headache is,
Here.
and then just don't touch your eyes. Yes, rub it up in your hair
It's actually
here.
an eyedropper.
You definitely don't eye drop.
Caitlin's getting a lesson in some
Essential oils.
some essential oils. This podcast is brought to you by Magic is Essential, Young Living Essential Oils.
And then rub your hands together and breathe it in too.
I have this one at home.
Carefully.
Peppermint, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we have.
It'll
I have
wake you
that
up.
I
in
should
my
have brought
purse
it.
all the
At
time.
ACA and RZIM, when we did,
Everyone
when
asked for it.
everybody asked me before they went to speak for some peppermint, you have peppermints, and they'd rub it on the back
Just
of their
like
necks and
vats
Where the
forehead.
drugs at?
I need a hit, man. I need a hit.
Oh, it smells so good.
Now it seems
That's
to
sweet,
me.
sweet mint.
That's right. Sweet man.
Wait a second. Now it seems okay. Now it seems to me that the only way to refute the critic here is to show that the same prima facie case is equally plausible in some instance where we all know, not by faith or by logic, but empirically, that it is in fact false. Can we find an instance of higher and lower where the higher is within almost everyone's experience? I think we can. Consider the following quotation from Pepys's diary. With my wife to the king's house to see the Virgin Martyr, and it is mighty pleasant. But that which did please me beyond anything in the whole world is the wind music when the angel comes down, which is so sweet that it ravished me, and indeed, in a word, did wrap up my soul, so that it made me really sick, just as I have formerly been when in love with my wife, and makes me resolve to practice wind music and to make my wife do the like.
Okay, stop right there. So what two parallels is he drawing here?
First of all, that's 1600s. That's cool.
Yeah, that is. I think his name's Pepys.
Peeps? Pepys?
Samuel Pepys. Pepys. I think that's what it is.
I mean, this goes back to what Randy was saying the other day with two sides of the same coin. What was it? What was the worst?
Coffee
sacred and like profane. Was
Yes.
it, Randy, that you're talking about? You're talking about profanity versus something that's sacred. Two sides of the same coin. That's what I mean. Talking about how he feels sick, but it feels the same feeling as whenever he was in love with his wife. It just shows how inadequate we are when it goes to like this whole thing that he's about to get into with transposition. How our feelings, like you said earlier, you can be in love with your wife and you can also be like love bourbon, but it's so different. So I think it was interesting though that he chose that. Like you said, that's from. Did you say the 16? When is that?
1668.
From? That's crazy that that's what he chose to give that example with.
So, wind music.
Very interesting.
And look at the so the wind music when angels came down was so sweet that it ravished me.
Ravished, made him sick.
Which is another. It's metaphorical in that sense. How can music ravish you? You know, and so it's like, well, I'm looking for a word. You understand what it means. It doesn't mean ravished. You know, but I'm limited in what I can do, and it made him sick. Right. All right, so he's going to go and explain some more here, so I won't get ahead of Lewis, and I'll let him.
I just want to look up wind music. Reading.
There are several points.
There are several points here that deserve attention. Firstly, that the internal sensation accompanying intense aesthetic delight was indistinguishable from the sensation accompanying two other experiences, that of being in love and that of being, say, in a rough channel crossing. That of these two other experiences, one at least is the very reverse of pleasurable. No man enjoys nausea. That Pepys was nevertheless anxious to have again the experience whose sensational accompaniment was identical with the very unpleasant accompaniments of sickness. That was why he decided to take up wind music.
So if the wind music ravaging him and made him sick was equivalent to the physical feelings of being seasick, I doubt he would have taken up wind music to create the nauseation of seasickness in him continually. So the transpositional language there failed him. Language failed him to adequately project or communicate actually what he felt. And so he was doing his absolute best to say, "Ugh, made me sick." You're like, these guys are pretty loquacious, but still he was limited in his ability to say, I was caught up in something that's beyond me, and the best word I have to say is, it was like falling in love. Which I remember by falling in love, and it made me sick to my stomach. But I loved it, and I want to do it again. And I want to do it again. I want to have that same feeling of falling in love over and over and over again. And so I'm going to take up the music so that I can inspire and engage in that whenever I please, because it's like the echo of the tune, not heard, right? He was hearing something. The artist was projecting something transcendent to him as well, and that's what artists do. They project a transcendent thought or a feeling through art or through music. And when we hit that, we're trying to express how we feel, and we come up short with our metaphors and our similes, and we only have human experiences to actually try to say, hey, it was like this. It was like being in the rough English channel, but I want to do it again. Go ahead.
Are we going to choose a way to say this guy's name?
Peeps.
Peeps.
Yes.
Peeps. I just feel like I just think of marshmallows.
Those nachos. That's a good job.
No.
Peeps.
Peeps. Peeps. All right, Peeps.
Google says peeps.
Google says Peeps. All right. Now, it may be true that not many of us have fully shared Peeps' experience, but we have all experienced that sort of thing. For myself, I find that if, during a moment of intense aesthetic rapture, one tries to turn round and catch by introspection what one is actually feeling, one can never lay one's hand on anything but a physical sensation.
Does anybody have anything on that?
I do.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, that's a great sentence.
That was my favorite part up until this point. So I just finished Surprised by Joy by Lewis, his autobiography, and he talks about this exact thing. I almost brought it up earlier because you said it's funny how he always intertwines his work. Everything he does reflects back on each other. Because as soon as I read that, I was reading both at the same time, like when I was reading this for last week's group. And it was so funny because I just read almost this exact sentence in his other book, Surprised by Joy. And I don't know which one was first, but I just think it's awesome how he goes into depth a lot more, I think, in Surprised by Joy about this one sentence. But just talking about how you can never actually hold anything. You can never grasp. If you turn around to look at hope, you're going to miss hope. You're going to not have that experience anymore. And then he gives that example. I think I made a post about it on social media about how he says, too many times we're looking at the wave's imprint on the sand instead of looking at the wave itself. Right. And then we miss it, so.
Well, he talks about, where was it? And was Way to Glory, we talk about nostalgia and romanticism, and we talk about this thing that, if I could only get back to where I was when I was a younger person. But when you get back there, it wasn't that you actually missed the place. You missed that feeling that you had, but you can't recapture that.
And we try to replicate it constantly.
You can't do it. Also, psychologically, you can't be in a conscious state of being and being conscious of I'm being right now, and then contemplate your consciousness of being.
Yeah.
You can't have those two thoughts simultaneously, and so. If you're being introspective, you can't catch it because your consciousness is not built that way to be able to I'm going to be here, but I'm also going to think about being here, and I'm going to put it all together and hold. You can't hold them both at the same time.
That's good.
Can't eat your cake and have it too.
No cake and having it.
Let them eat cake.
It's like the other day I was watching 1917 on Saturday. I got really pumped up towards well, I won't say where, but there was a part in that where I get really, really excited, and I'm just like, but that feeling, physical sensation, is completely indistinguishable from some physical sensations that I've had when reading a book about theology or reading some of Lewis's work. Like, I just get super, super excited, but the physical manifestation is the same. It's exactly the same, but it's completely different. Because in one moment I'm connected to a sort of a shared human experience, and in the other I'm connected to something outside of my shared human experience that can be shared by others, but is so far beyond what I can describe here. So it's
in our shared human inner workings that not everyone taps into.
It's just it's beyond.
We had something. So we were doing a group. We're going over Mere Christianity, and with high school kids, and these kids had not yet. The lights hadn't all come on yet. You'd see little flickers of lights coming on, popping on. You see, I'm starting to get it. And then we dissected Lewis's argument from desire, and or one of his other arguments. I think if a person is born blind, they would never know what the word dark is, and saying that the world has no meaning, you should never come to know the world has no meaning. And as we broke it down over 20 minutes, when we got finished, they were clapping and cheering as we got finished dissecting a Lewisian argument. And it was this going, like you would see at a sporting arena, if Nick Richards came through and dunked over somebody 2 hands, and you come up, it was like, all we did was break down an argument. And it was really cool to see those lights come on like that.
Introspection. Wait, is that correct? No.
In my case,
it is a kind of kick or flutter in the diaphragm. Perhaps that is all Pepys meant by really sick. But the important point is this. I find that this kick or flutter is exactly the same sensation which in me accompanies great and sudden anguish. Introspection can discover no difference at all between my neural response to very bad news and my neural response to the overture of the magic flute. We know he likes the magic flute. If I were to judge simply by sensation, it should come to the absurd conclusion that joy and anguish are the same thing, that what I most dread is the same with what I most desire. Introspection discovers nothing more or different in the one than in the other, and I expect that most of you, if you are in the habit of noticing such things, will report more or less the same.
So he's pulled the thread on the sweater of the cynic, who says love and lust into the same act, therefore the same thing. And he's just starting to tug on it, and you start to see it begin to unravel. And if I'm the cynic, I'm realizing that my feet are on sand and the tide's coming in, and I'm going to be swept out pretty soon. And he says that what I most dread cannot be the thing that I most desire. That's not logically valid. That would be cognitive dissonance for me to both dread and desire something at the same time. So one of these is different. And even though I have a similar physical experience, that something else is going on.
You're saying that Lewis is saying can't dread and desire something at the same time?
Well, he's saying that if it would be an absurd conclusion that joy and anguish are the same thing. So you can't. Joy and anguish are different, but they can produce similar physical sensations in your body.
Yeah.
But they're different. Joy and anguish are different things, and so I don't think you wouldn't want to say they're equivalent. They're exactly so. Joy is equal, whole cloth, to anguish, whole cloth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he's saying.
Pure definition.
Yes, in a pure definition. And so, because the cynic is saying that love, whole cloth, and lust, whole cloth, are equally the same because they end in the same act. So Lewis is pulling that apart and going, well, no, because there has to be, even though the act results in the same thing, the intention and meaning and understanding.
Isn't that equal logical fallacy? It's like, just because, am I thinking of that correctly? Just to assume that correlation, causation are the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Isn't that basically what he's saying here?
Yes. He's saying, yeah. So that would be causation and correlation, yes. Because the act is the same, therefore it is the same. So it would be like, if P then Q, P therefore Q. It would be like the logical argument. But it would be invalid because they can't be the same thing just because they result in the same action.
Well, that's where the whole transposition thing comes in, right? Because he's trying to say if you look from the bottom up, you're always going to see that, right?
Yeah, it's like
From top down, you'll see.
If you look from the epistemic, from epistemology, from your point of view, looking up, yeah, it's all going to look the same. And you're like, well, it's the same act, so therefore it's the same thing. But if you realize right here that wait, they can't be the same thing because there's a slight difference. And if you look from the top down, then yeah, suddenly you start to see, oh, this is much different. Again, like I love bourbon, I love my wife. That word love is not even equivalent. I'm saying something else, even though the word is spelled the same. It's linguistically the same.
That's where I'm like struggling a bit. Is I just think there's some lack of definitions because I can see joy and anguish truly being the same thing, depending on how you're defining joy in a particular moment, right? Like you were given the example of like love, right? And I think that like I love my kids in a very consistent day to day, love, but there are moments of like joy, for example, that are just like the qualification of anguish. Is just okay. Well, let me put it like this. There's a better argument. And this is me kind of being pretty transparent here, but when Bethany passed away, I was in like the most anguish I've ever been in my entire life. That was itself an expression of love through all of that.
Right.
And so for me, like now that changes over time in the way that, but in that moment, I would put the two of those things together in almost the same definition.
Anguish and love?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's saying anguish and joy.
Right. But yeah, my point is though, just like mixing definitely, but that was one particular experience I could see in a more holy, more just happy kind of experience that you could have the same kind of symbiotic relationship in those things. You know what I'm saying? Like
we are.
On a wedding day or the birth of a child or something like that, where it's just like it's almost like what.
So I think that linguistically, we're going to get caught up because we are limited in our even when, like you say, even when someone says anguish. Right.
We're limited on our limitations.
We're limited. Yeah. So when someone says anguish, there is love in that, and there is actually some joy in hope and stuff inside of that. But we're limited. So, but I think what Lewis is saying here is that there is actually something transcendent in anguish. There is an anguish that is above it. Like there's something that is objectively anguish, and there's something that's objectively joy. and you can't have your desire. You can't have a desire for joy, and then what's he say there? You can't. And the third conclusion that joy and anguish are the same thing. What I most dread is the same thing what I most desire. It almost seems to be a cognitive dissonance for you to dread something to where it would paralyze you because it's something you don't want. But then to say, well, that's the thing I most desire is to be in a state that causes me most fear, and because to me, in that sense, that kind of anguish for what I'm saying, this is me from talking about is this thing that separates me. Joy draws me in, and for me, anguish is something that separates. In that
and
sense,
yet we're called to, like in Scripture, we are called to both fear and love God simultaneously. Where one is, the flip side of the coin of the other, basically.
Is that fear the same thing as like what being paralyzed to go outside at night? Fear of a car accident or this debilitating fear. That's how I'm seeing it. So that's you guys can feel free to.
Yeah, it's like more fear and awe. Like you're fearful because you're in awe of who he is, right?
But again, we're getting it's losing a definition.
This is where I'm like a little bit like with some of these things. I think they come really close. Like there's a necessity in the definitions, and if you're saying here's objective joy, here's objective anguish, that we can't. They're total opposites of each other. In those definitions, like he hasn't given us definitions to work with,
right?
And yet, that's a lot of what he's talking about, isn't it? The inability to define. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
I haven't read it like everyone else. I caught up while we were here.
Well, at least from what I've been able to pull from it so far, is it seems like he's hitting at anguish being broken hope and joy being fulfilled hope. And
that's how I understand it.
Yeah, and at least that's what I definitely get where you're hitting at, and that whenever you're having an argument where you're trying to reach any sort of conclusion, you need to make sure the participants are on the same discussional ground. Because if you're trying to discuss and have a conversation where your idea of fear and mine or our idea of love is different, we're never going to come to an understanding because we don't understand each other.
That's the whole point.
That's the point.
Yeah, it's the point of this, that we're limited in our communication, but yet we're trying to communicate a shared experience. And all that we have is a limited language that is full of analogies and metaphors. And if we don't hit those metaphors correctly, we're going to say things that are incorrect or less correct. And if we say too many of these things that are incorrect or less correct, then we start to say things that become fallacious and heretical and actually take us away from our relationship with God instead of closer to it. So we need to wrestle these things out. We need to push forward into this, and we need to have moments where we go, okay, what is really meant by this? This is why they had the creeds and the councils and all this, was to pull, what are we actually saying? That's what they were about. What are we actually getting at here? So Christ, so Jesus is God. What does that mean? What are we saying?
Yeah. So, and y'all may be discussing things before I got here, so I apologize if you are. I'm not sure about things when you guys are talking about objective things and things like that. So I'm not really sure. I'm not sure where if that's somewhere else.
It's not.
Okay. So all I'm seeing is that he's kind of saying that the baseline, like internal sensation, if you reflect on what you are physically experiencing when you are experiencing anguish or when you're experiencing joy, is often the same thing. You feel something in the pit of your stomach, maybe a tightness in your chest. And so there is between anguish and joy a shared physical sensation.
Yeah.
So that in order to say something that anguish and joy are different, it has to be something more than the physical sensation, because it's the same sensation. If you just reflect on, what am I feeling? Well, my chest is tight, my stomach hurts. So if we're saying, well, then if it's just physical sensations, then joy and anguish are the same thing.
Right.
But, so I'm looking down where he says, when the joy thus flows over into the nerves that overflow into its consummation, when the anguish thus flows over that physical symptom is the crowning horror, the very same thing which makes the sweetest drop of all in the sweetest cup, and also makes the bitterest drop in the bitter. So it's almost like saying, so there is a shared experience between anguish and joy, but something more than physical sensation has got to define them as two different things. Otherwise, the physical sensations are just the same.
Exactly.
So that's what I'm tracking. So again, I
So
apologize.
no, you're fine. And Randy, the next paragraph actually, that's where he begins to define. I think you're talking about he defines the joy and anguish a little better in the next section there.
So I think he's agreeing there's a shared sense in which sensations, they could be identical if you're just sort of reflecting, and maybe we would push and say, well, there's some nuance in what I'm feeling. But if you were to just make a list of things, the list might be very similar of like basic physical responses.
You can be blinded by the sun and blind in darkness, but they're not the same blindness.
Exactly. So maybe there's some nuance, but ultimately there are some things that are going to overlap.
Well, there's a lot of psychology around like changing your mindset around physical sensations. Like if you're really anxious or nervous, you can tell yourself, I'm not nervous, I'm excited. And the psychology around putting a different name to the physical sensation and what that can do for your whatever.
Different meaning to the physical sensation.
Makes sense. I mean,
So meaning plays a big part in
Context.
because we can do the same. I mean, same thing with like scent. Like we, for a period of time, we might smell something like brownies when we were kids, but we had an abusive parent, and every time they, it could be connected to abuse, and then later on in life it becomes something different because we choose to associate it with something different. I mean, and that's just on a very basic scale, but.
Yeah, so I think, as I often do when I'm reading, I get ahead of myself.
What?
And
And I thought two strict scriptures have been popping in my head that kind of hit these two things. One we're talking about, I think a good word for this is in Corinthians to talk about this, like the wording Paul uses is effects. He says there are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things through the person. So when we're talking about sensations, Scripture that talks about that is like effects, like. And then the next verse is, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. Which, those two things are like put together.
To be buried.
What verse?
This one right here is 1 Corinthians 12:6.
Real version.
Waiting for the puppies.
So they're connected.
no, that's
Open group.
yeah. Go for it.
I brought it here.
It's good.
Yes, we feel free to engage in personal heresies and vices during tonight.
It's always
Made
always
wine to
welcome.
make men's hearts glad. That's what Scripture
That's
says.
right.
Yes.
Preach.
Old Testament right there.
Preach.
That's another
That'll preach.
And yet the educational institution is trying to tamp out the word of the Lord.
That's right.
new wine.
No, so it is funny that what Robert pointed out was exactly the conversation that Randy and I were having. In the paragraph later, he goes into a little more definition and explains it.
I think if we read the next page, it's everything we just said.
Yeah. And I have so tried to hold back, honestly. So basically, when joy thus flows over into the nerves, as Robert read, that overflows its consummation. When anguish thus flows over the physical symptoms, it is the crowning horror. The very same thing which makes the sweetest drop in all the sweet cup also makes the bitterest drop in the bitter. Yeah. All right, and start at here and here.
And here I suggest we have found what we are looking for. I take our emotional life to be higher than the life of our sensations. Not, of course, morally higher, but richer, more varied, more subtle. And this is a higher level which nearly all of us know. And I believe that if anyone watches carefully the relation between his emotions and his sensations, he will discover the following facts. 1, that the nerves do respond, and in a sense most adequately and exquisitely to the emotions. 2, that their resources are far more limited, the possible variations of sense far fewer than those of emotion. 3, and that the senses compensate for this by using the same sensation to express more than one emotion, even as we have seen to express opposite emotions.
Yeah, we hit that pretty hard earlier.
It's still a good subject.
He has a way with saying it,
Yeah.
We say it, but then he says it, and I'm like, whoa.
I'm just looking at it again.
Yeah. Anybody have any thoughts they want to throw out on that?
It's dope.
Dope.
Yeah.
I remember Lisa, my friend Lisa, when her, you know Lisa. I was like, who else knows Lisa? You know Lisa. Her brother and an aunt died within a very close time period. She has 9 siblings. And when this particular brother died, of course, it was very difficult. And she's typically the most joyful person you will ever meet, like literally, no matter the circumstances, legit joy. And so when she went to her brother's funeral and then found out that her aunt had just passed away, she just collapsed on the floor, very unlike her. And she said, God, this is too much. It's too much pain. And then about 1 month later, she and I went to New York City to be crazy and go sit out by 30 Rock and camp out to go see Jimmy Fallon. And it's just a few years ago. And we had this series of incredible experiences throughout our weekend there. You know, we met, what's his face?
Joe Lieberman.
Joe Lieberman on the plane. They put us in first class for no reason. The plane was empty, and they took us from the empty back to the first class, and there were other people in the back. They just grabbed us. I don't know why. Someone gave us tickets to another show free. All this stuff happened, and the last thing was we get on the plane, they put us in first class, and we don't know why. And both of us are crying because it's just been this wonderful weekend. And then she's just like, she said, Lord, this is too much. Mm-hmm. Her soul, her heart was like overflowing with this. It was too much joy. She almost couldn't handle how good God was being to her heart. And but it was the same reaction, but in the same weight, but with a different experience. You know, I mean, same experience, but different emotion, joy versus pain, with similar physical sensations.
It's so weird that you say it like that. It gave me chills because on my social media, I think it was in October, I was coming to these groups, I think. I just started. I went on that trip to Puerto Rico, and we were out and looking at, you know, they have these killing fields where it was like really horrible and tragic, but it was so beautiful. Like it's almost weird how horrible it is, but how beautiful. And so I'd have a picture of me like standing like this. Like my friend's a photographer, and she took a picture of me, and I actually made a post that said, in that time, because you all know how my life's been the past 6 months or a year. It's been literally the epitome of joy and the epitome of anguish. Yeah. And I've made a post, and I literally said, it's funny how 6 months ago I remember going home and weeping by my bed and saying, what did I do to deserve this? Because I'm so happy. Like, I'm so joyful. And you can go, it's funny because I'll probably go back. I haven't seen that post. I mean, it's been months. But I'm going to go back and read it because you just reminded me. And then I said, now I sit here by my bed still weeping and saying, what did I do to deserve this? In the complete opposite way. Yeah. So it's crazy how those feelings are so...
It's like the same and yet completely different.
It's like that poem that I read last time, the deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy. It's like the deeper your cup is for sorrow, the more joy it can hold in the future. It's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, am I reading more? Yeah. Is it where we tend? Yep. Okay. Where we tend to go wrong is in assuming that if there is to be a correspondence between two systems, it must be a one-for-one correspondence, that A in the one system must be represented by A in the other, and so on. But the correspondence between emotion and sensation turns out not to be of that sort, and there never could be a correspondence of that sort where the one system was really richer than the other. If the richer system is to be represented in the poorer at all, this can only be by giving each element in the poorer system more than one meaning. The transposition of the richer into the poorer must, so to speak, be algebraical, not arithmetical. If you are to translate from a language which has a large vocabulary into a language that has a small vocabulary, then you must be allowed to use several words in more than one sense. If you are to write a language with 22 vowel sounds in an alphabet with only 5 vowel characters, that you must be allowed to give each of those 5 characters more than one value. If you are making a piano version of a piece originally scored for an orchestra, then the same piano notes which represent flutes in one passage must also represent violins in another.
So good.
That's poetic.
Just dropped the mic. I mean, he basically just undid the entire cynic's argument right there and just proved, for me, I mean, I read this and I'm like, I don't need to read anymore. You sold me. I'll buy whatever you're selling. This was It was so rich because he hit on so many levels. And this hits me because this is what I've been thinking about for years. And I think I said it last time, but I'll say it again. That I think, personally, that language is discoverable. That it's not, we didn't create language. I think communication is something that's discoverable, and we just use linguistics as a tool and how to communicate. But that the fact that in Genesis God spoke and God had communicative acts means that there is transcendent communication. And because we have limited consciousness and limited minds and limited vocal limitations, that right here, that it's not a one-to-one, you know. So in an essay I wrote about Genesis 1 and 2 being cohesive narratives, I talk about, isn't it interesting, when God said to man, be fruitful and multiply, when you read chapter 1, that's the divine. Chapter 1, there's no chaos. There's no friction. God said it happens, it's good. God said it happens, it's good. God said it happens, it's good. When you read chapter 2, it starts out with, this didn't happen because of this. And suddenly there's chaos and there's frictions and things aren't happening. And when man hears it, God commanded him to be fruitful and multiply. But in Genesis 1, God said. And so it's that whole thing of transpositionally, us in our limited state of uncertainty and having fear and a fall and all this kind of stuff, it's like, oh, God commanded. You know, there's this difference that we're seeing it from our perspective. And I think he hits it right there so well, that when you go from one dimension to another, you get a dilution of the ability to communicate it precisely.
Mm-hmm. It's like talking to young children a lot of times. Like, we have a much broader vocabulary. You have to convey something to a child. It's often difficult to use the same level of vocabulary we would use with another adult. You have to simplify it to an extent for them to be able to pick it up.
But also, you wouldn't be able to dumb it down unless you knew of the higher.
Yeah.
You can't dumb something down unless you know that. And so that's his whole point.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then what if there's no context?
Right.
Or, like, I think it's Briscoe. Has anyone read Briscoe? I think it's Briscoe, where he goes into the Amazon, I think, and meets a tribe that doesn't read and has no idea what reading and scripture. He can't discuss scripture because there's no such thing as books. And he's trying to figure out, how do I convey the meaning of scripture to people who can't even read and have no concept of that, because he's a missionary. He wants to convey the Bible to them, and yet the Holy Spirit comes in and doesn't find a way. Is able, like, through his love of the people, is able to come and speaks to them. They begin to understand what scripture and truth is through banana leaves. You have to read it. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, wait, is this the... Yes. Is this... What was the book called?
Briscoe? I believe it's
a similar
Briscoe.
book to this.
It might be a different one. It might be a different
Same guy
title.
who wrote, like, Peace Child.
I don't think it's Peace Child, because Peace Child is about the rebellious, how they're... Peace Child is the one where they, like, compete on who's the most cunning and dastardly, right?
There was another one where the banana leaf rolled up was, like...
I thought that was Briscoe. I could be wrong. I
can't remember the name of it.
Anyways, it's amazing, like, how it goes... He went beyond language. Because I always am like, how do you convey the gospel, and yet, the rocks cry out.
So it goes full circle into Chris's context. How do you have to have context, and you have to have shared experience, and then you have to have some way for this other sentient conscious being to comprehend what you're trying to express to them, and you have to find a way linguistically, verbally, somehow, and then once they get it, then there's a bond created once the communication has been connected there.
Today, this is as for Revival 50th anniversary.
So is it this week?
Well, today is the 50th anniversary.
Wow.
And interesting is yesterday the Chiefs won, and 50 years ago, the day before, it was the last day the Chiefs won.
Whoa.
50 years later.
So new revival is what you're
That's
saying.
right.
Yeah.
But my son was looking at the posters from the 1970s. My father-in-law and mine passed away. Their best one was one of the first people to get up and give testimonies. And my son Noah was like, "What is revival?" I was like, "Oh my gosh!" They asked me these questions that are like students are asking these questions in class that are like so thick. What is revival?
That's a loaded question.
First, I had to break down the word. I said, "Well, what does it mean to rebuild your Legos?" Well, it's broken down, and you put it back together. What does it mean to redo? And then we say, I had to break down the words. It means to revive life, to make something alive. And then I started to explain it. He's like, "Well, what's the importance?" And I started to have to give that experience from my father-in-law, because he was there when he said, when you come near Hughes, you would feel a tangible presence. And he said it was almost eerie in a ghostly kind of like, that's the best way you can describe it. You could feel it before you came close to the building. And I was trying to explain, how do you explain to a 9-year-old what the tangible presence is when it's something you can't see?
An eerie, ghostly experience, isn't it?
But it was joyful at the same time.
The Holy Ghost.
And they don't have the same correlations that we do with ghosts
son
and
is very
eerie. And
analytical. Naomi immediately understands this, the other twin.
Yeah.
He needs to understand. He's very analytical. We call him the engineer. Break this down for me. But it's like, how do you break down something that's a shared experience that's not visual? You can see the effects of it.
Yeah.
But you can't actually tangibly.
it's a good C.S. Lewis quote.
Yes.
Yeah, you can go ahead and say it.
Yeah.
The one about
Yeah,
the
go.
sun.
Oh yeah. Well, I believe in Christianity like I believe in the sun, not because I see it, but because of the sun, I see everything else.
Oh, I hate that quote so much.
Yeah, I had some
So you
people.
hate that quote?
No,
No.
it's just people
had some
who
friends
start
in
hating
Oxford
on
who like-
Lewis. They're like, "Oh, I'm so tired of the quote."
Such a good quote.
It's a wonderful quote.
It's beautiful.
It's an amazing quote. The funny thing is, it's not really Lewis's; it's Chesterton's. He borrowed it almost verbatim from Chesterton, but nobody remembers Chesterton saying it.
By the way, it was Brushko, Bruce Olson, and
Bruce Olson, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, Bruce.
Brushko.
Bruce,
It was.
that's right.
He's trying to. This guy. These people were like, we no longer know God, and this warrior had deep sorrow. And another man joined the conversation, related a legend that made Bruce's hair stand on end. A tall prophet with yellow hair will come to us carrying banana stalks. Knowledge of life and God will come out of those stalks, and God will show us the way back to Him. And Bruce Olson is a man, tall man with yellow hair. And one of the Indians walked over to a nearby banana tree, cut off a section, and tossed it toward Bruce. "This is the kind of banana stalk God can come from," he said. It rolled at their feet. A Motolone swatted at it with his machete, accidentally splitting it in half, leaves still inside the stalk, waiting to develop and come out, started peeling off. Lying at the base of the stalk, they looked like pages from a book. And then he's like, "This is God's banana stalk," and goes on to share, learn to share the gospel with
Can I
them.
make a comment about this? Yeah. Because I feel like this is something that we mess as an artist. I feel like Christians just in the world, we mess this up. We assume everything is highly poetic when many times God is just trying to translate something to us so we can understand it. He's not saying that the Bible is like a banana leaf, and we think, oh, so it bears fruit every year. It's in a warm climate. He's actually saying, literally, if you cut open a banana leaf,
it's pages of a book.
It physically looks like a book. It is a book, and it's like, this is something that frustrates me. It's like, and the man was yellow-haired. It wasn't like the sun. That's like his. I just feel like we read things
Such
like
an artist thing.
Well, I feel like we read. I feel like we read things like God, like streams in the desert. We think of everything but physical streams in the desert, what it actually is. And it's like we actually miss things because we don't just like, maybe he's just trying to simplify it for us so we will have a picture of physically seeing it so we'll recognize it. Like that book.
I feel like that's something we're discovering a lot with this documentary that we're working on is like there's just so much nature in the Bible, and it feels like people don't even see it because they're trying so hard to grasp the whatever that is, the metaphor from it.
I gotta bring you guys to Israel and have meat farmers and stuff over there.
Because it seems they're just like, oh well, it's not real nature.
It's real stuff.
Or go
It's all figurative language.
Go to Jericho and see the stream going straight through it in the middle of the desert.
Exactly. I mean, it's anyways.
Yeah, sorry, we could talk about that for a long time.
No, I think that's great parallels to bring in, and solidifies exactly what Lewis is trying to get at here.
It's like the Eucharist when he talks about the Eucharist. I think that's like a lot of people assume that's metaphorical, but there's many believers who especially Catholics, who believe it's very literal and physical at the same time, and mystical at the same time.
And Lewis believed that at the end of his life.
It seems like he did.
Yeah, he began to believe that there was something salvific about taking the Eucharist, that there was some sort of transubstantial thing that actually occurred when he did that. And so he was very faithful in taking the Eucharist and had it at his bedside and had it at Joy's bedside. And so, and people take, Jesus said, unless you eat and drink of this, you shall have no part of me. They take it like literally. He means, unless you eat of this and drink of this, you will not have...
Another fun thing to explain to children.
Yes.
Eat my flesh.
Oh, you're cannibals, in a sense.
I don't want to be a zombie.
That's a perfect segue, though, for what he's about to talk about with the boy in the dungeon that you brought. Remember that we talked about earlier? That's my favorite. That's
really
yeah. So we'll get to that next time.
Yeah.
Because we want to really pull that apart. I actually did this with Eliana yesterday because we were talking in the car about the song "Never Enough," and Eliana said, "I had the exact same thought as you were doing that about maybe she's thinking about heaven when she's singing Never Enough." Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about transposition. I can talk to Eliana just like almost like I talk to you guys. Like, do you know what transpositionalism is? And she's like, well, what is it? So I actually drew her a picture using just geometrical shapes, but she attributed a greater meaning to those. And so then I even drew the guy inside the picture, holding a picture of a picture. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, how far can you go down into that
rabbit hole?
That rabbit hole.
It's interesting in design, 2D design today. I'm trying to teach them about symmetry and design and shapes, but then at the same time, and in figure drawing I was trying to talk about this, is that the thing itself, it's not just a symbol of something, it's actually an experience of something, all at the same time. And it's like, how does this shape translate to your experience? How do you feel when you look at this shape? Which is the core of all graphic design and design, is that it's not just a curved line, it's that there's something about this that translates to some experience you've had in life where you actually receive a download of information by looking at this curved line. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, the feeling you get when you're on a swing when you're 5 years old, and you swing and you let go, that feeling of like inertia, you can recreate that feeling with just a line like this, and people are like, oh, I feel something. And it's just a line. But no, it's something, it's actually a translation of an experience. And I don't know.
Now I get nauseous on swings.
Context and meaning and...
I need an architecture to tell that.
So when you see a line, you're like, no.
He's not. He would not tell me
It's
that.
like I try to communicate that to my students learning like the beginnings of cinematography. It's like there's all the difference in the world between you going like this and going this way with the camera and going like this. And you can say one way or the other, what you think it is, but at the end of the day, it's very difficult for you to describe without using, very technical terminology, what exactly this means versus what exactly this means to you.
Yeah.
And like you said, even if you see the same things in both shots, even if, say, you get to see the same visuals, it still feels different.
Yep.
It's good.
Exactly.
But it's universal. That's the thing that's interesting about this language subject, is that things maybe feel like a thin word, but I feel like a lot of these words, like I look for universal things. I feel like there's a universal experience that most people have experience with sunsets on the planet. There's usually sunsets everywhere you go, unless you're stuck in a dungeon.
It's true.
So they'll have an experience with a sunset, whether you're an Eskimo in Alaska, or whether you're in Kenya, or whether you're in Kentucky, some kind of experience with a sunset. So it's like some experience with easy to reach beauty.
I was just listening to a talk today on CGI, which has to do with some of the stuff that Evan gave me the links to it. It's really good. This guy talks about that CGI is really hard to get it to be quote unquote realistic, which means able for humans to relate to it, to be able to draw benefits from the narrative. Because if you create a CGI story, but the CGI is unbelievable or it's unrelatable to the person, it doesn't matter what your narrative is, they're not going to buy it. You didn't suspend their disbelief. That's what it's called, suspending the disbelief. Yeah. And but it's interesting that in order for you to suspend disbelief, even what you create has to be relatable to the human consciousness, has to be relatable to the human mind. And the human mind can pick up if it's not and be immediately dissuaded to go, no, I'm not in. But we don't know yet what it necessarily is that makes humans human, but we know when we don't see it. It's like we know when we don't see it. It's like, no, this is not relatable to me. The narrative doesn't matter because even so, that's what part of what I talk about is in imagination. You have to have a synthesis of imagination and reason, right? If you have too much imagination, you're going to create non-human characters that are unrelatable, and it'll be chaos, and no one will be able to draw any benefit from that story or whatever. But if you're too abstract on the reason side, you're going to have an algebraic textbook that no one can read or pay attention to because it's just formulaic, and it won't be relatable to human consciousness or human spirit. So you have to bring those together to create something that actually mimics the human condition and the human experience in order for your narrative to be beneficial for us today, in the future, in the past, and us creating the narrative to find meaning and context for our lives.
Isn't it interesting that like some of the most human story that you can find out there is in a world that is completely CGI, like Toy Story?
Yeah.
And then but it's because the entire
It's
thing
all
works together
entirely,
as a cohesive whole.
Yes.
And it's very similar to the kind of thing he brings up with later on when it comes to the paintings and things like that. But
I was even talking about the difference between film and digital. For me, anyways, because I see those two mediums, and like when we were watching Rise of Skywalker, I said to Wes, somewhere in the middle, I'm like, I think this is shot on film. Like it looks different, it feels different. And then I looked afterwards. Of course, it was Kodak film. Of course, they use CGI in there, but there's still even a difference and a different feeling from something tangible to a little less tangible with digital, which is strange to me.
Yep, it's definitely true. We can still tell even if we don't know what it is.
Yeah,
and
there's some feeling we have, or something our eyes catch.
The analog nature of it.
Yes.
That's capturing it as it is, and just an impression on a set of chemicals.
Exactly, yeah.
That book you gave me, the Save the Cat Writes a Novel, that she talks about that a lot, about finding the healthy balance between those, and that's what makes a novel so successful. And like Harry Potter, and she gives a million, back to old, even Pinocchio. She starts talking about Pinocchio and why that story is so powerful.
About that,
Well, yeah, I mean, Jordan Peterson says that the story of Pinocchio may be the oldest story known to humankind. Of course, now this is coming from a guy who's a clinical psychologist, not a Christian, but he says this story of Pinocchio going down into the belly of the beast to resurrect the spirit of his father is one of the oldest stories known. And if you think about it, that is actually the story of the cross, right? Going down to the pit of hell to bring back the spirit of the father to reconcile. So that's that story, and it hits us because it doesn't make any sense for Pinocchio to go down into a whale. I mean, what sense does that make? But we read that and we go, we automatically believe it. We're, our disbelief is suspended. We're like, yeah, because it hits us somewhere, and we don't know where, but it hits us. We're going, yeah, that archetypal subconscious thing inside of me, as Jung would say, yeah, it hits that. And so we have these stories, and what Save the Cat does, it says there are certain plot patterns that you have to follow if you want a story to be successful, because you will not suspend disbelief if you don't do that. You'll lose the reader. And then, no matter what you have to say, it won't matter.
She said, with wooden boys and animals that talk and do all sorts of things.
If you continue down this path, you will become a jackass. That is
wooden boys. I'm a real boy.
Yes, it's Blake's, and I think that one, the Save the Cat as a novel, is from the takeoff
a different
of Blake
person.
Snyder's
It is, yes.
original,
It
which is screenwriting
That's a
one.
screen,
But it's all the same thing.
Yeah, she
the hero's journey. And
she's like, yes, that dude with a problem.
Yeah,
all those kind of things. So
it's really universal, and yet we have a lot of people who rebel from that in the cinematic world nowadays. They really don't want to do it, but as soon as they get away from it, all of a sudden their film just tanks.
It's because humanity is. There's a reason we all have this common thread that pulls us all together. We relate to something as a human race, and you can't. If you try to rebel against it, it's
unrelatable, right? No one has that experience. No one has the human experience of the thing that's not within the
human
parameters,
experience.
the human experience. And so you're like, well, that's fine if that thing does, that non-entity out there does that, but that has nothing to do with me, so why would I care what that thing does or that? And so
She gives the best ever example. She says a lot of people don't like, in cinematography or in art, they don't like the F word, the formula word. No one wants to follow a formula if you're creative. She said, but it's like baking a cake. There's some ingredients you have to bake a cake, but there's a million kinds of cake you can have. You can have any kind of cake, and it's going to taste different. It's going to be, cheesecake's good, chocolate's
Yes.
good,
Yeah.
all of it is good, but
It's
they
good.
still have to have eggs, milk, butter, And I thought that example, she was like, so for all those people who are like wanting to put this book down right now, like just hear me out. And it was really good.
Awesome.
yeah, and think about all the successful authors who actually have created worlds that people get to interact in. She said that
amazing.
J.K. Rowling's
Yeah.
Harry Potter, the very first one, actually is follows the pattern more closely than any book she's
Yeah.
ever read.
Yeah.
And you
It's
go,
really spot on.
Yeah.
you go, oh well, okay, but again, so pointing something Chris said, you can write a story using that formula, but if you're not creative, if you don't have imagination, it'll fail too.
Yeah.
It's like Will Smith. We were watching this. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this on HBO. It's Uncut, Barbershop Uncut. It's like it's a bunch of celebrities.
Yeah.
and
LeBron James has
LeBron
this.
James. It's really good,
It's like
actually.
a barbershop.
They just sit around and talk about
And
whatever.
somebody gets their hair cut while they're doing
and
it.
someone's getting their hair cut. They switch around. But anyways, Will Smith, they asked him if he had any like roles he skipped out on and regretted. And he's like, well, I don't really live in a lot of regret, because Wild Wild West, a lot of people make fun of. He's like, but, still it's an experience added to my life. He's like, but he took Wild Wild West over The Matrix. He said, he's like, The Matrix may be my biggest loss of role. He said, but listen to how they described it to him. He's like, so they pitched The Matrix to me, and they're like, dude, it's gonna be like really awesome. Like you're gonna be like suspended. He was for Neo. You're gonna be like suspended in air, and then you're gonna freeze, and then the cameras are gonna be like panning around you, and it's gonna see you from 360 degrees, and you're gonna be frozen.
And you're going to do like kung fu moves and things like that.
And he's like, yeah, no, I'm out.
I'll do Wild Wild West.
And then, of course, this movie becomes this like epic saga that everyone relates to. But it's
They buried
because
the lead. They didn't give him the story.
Yeah. Of course, Keanu would be like, yeah, dude, let's get it.
But they did find the bright side was the fact that because it's mostly, not always, but it's mostly African Americans that are in this barbershop talking. And this one guy says, but what's awesome is Morpheus is like, he's the guy everyone goes to. He's the main guy. And he was a black man. It wasn't because he was black. It was
the
just...
Oracle, who is
Yes, the Oracle too.
Yeah.
mother-father figure.
It's like, so these
Yeah.
important characters were black leads, but they weren't chosen because they were black. They were just characters, and that's what they really appreciate about the movie. So, although Will Smith could have been Neo, they all agreed like it was really special the way it did turn out.
Yeah.
So, anyways, that was just.
This is what I was thinking about The Matrix a couple minutes ago before you said something about it. Was there's a section where he's about to take the pills. He takes the pill and then he shows them the Matrix and he said, "This is not the original Matrix. The original Matrix was perfect, was pristine work." Wait, no, maybe this was Anyway, I don't know where the answer. It was the creator.
It's been 21
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
It's like when I was in college. So
Everybody rejected it. He said they all rejected it. Fires broke out in natural disasters. They rejected a perfect world. And so we recreated it in your image, flawed, and then people received it. Which I thought was really interesting.
Wow, yes.
Yeah. Well, nope, I don't want to do that. Let's really spoil the show. Never
I've
mind.
seen all of them.
No, not that. It's completely different.
a show.
Yeah.
I think I know what show you're talking about.
Yeah.
What show?
It's
What's it called,
completely
though?
different. The Good Place.
Yeah,
okay.
the latest season of The Good Place.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've only started it. Wes is not sure about it. You have to give him hope.
You have to plow through some murky water.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then
well,
by season 2, it's all of a sudden like, oh,
Because I'm sloshing around and I'm like, I don't know.
Sloshing in season 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It does not pick up, and they.
can you skip to season 2?
No.
No.
You have to go through
You
it.
push through.
You have to go through the murky waters.
The whole
get the
thing.
candy cane
The whole
forest.
thing has a
All right.
long-term plot that you're not seeing.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. There's hope there. I'll
You
give it
see,
a
it had to
shot.
be someone other than me telling him this because he.
No, the final season, prime. It's
Okay.
good.
It's pretty good.
There we go.
Some deep philosophical.
Look at
stuff.
all these intellectuals saying the good
I
ways.
know. So I guess I have to do it now.
I'm
With
not.
me-
See, my mom's
characters.
tried to get me to watch it for a long time because
It's
my
like
mom
really
likes
funny,
shows
man.
like that, and I
Watch it.
hate them, so I have not given it a chance. So maybe I should.
I love it.
Maybe I should give it a chance.
Yeah, you do have to plow through the first season, but it's deliberately it's not what it appears.
All right.
In terms of the tone of the show.
Yeah. The tone is
Okay.
other than
All right.
what it seems.
And that's the end of this podcast.
That is the end of the
that's
podcast,
right.
guys.
Good plan.
This was really good stuff. I can't wait to get into the cavern and the drawings and all that.
Why do British people have to mess up?
Not to do drawings.
All right, guys. This has been Vera and Fabula down at Drinklings in Wilmore, Kentucky. We'll see you guys next